black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. We're joined today by Professor Jakobi Williams, Associate Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. He's also the author from The Bullet to the Ballot, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and Racial Coalition Politics in Chicago, published by our friends down the road, UNC Press. How you doing, Jakobi?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Let me start by asking the reasons why you're here at Duke now, the SIPA program. Can you talk a little bit about the program?
Well, I was invited here by yourself and Carrie Haney to serve as a mentor for junior faculty who are in need of mentorship and looking for connections and networking opportunities for folks outside of their home institutions to help them along with the process. And so when I was contacted by Haney, Dr. Haney, I was reluctant at first because I'm on sabbatical trying to finish this book. But having been in that position before and all the pitfalls and mistakes that I made, but not having those avenues and assistance and people to lead and guide me down the road, I think I might have been the first one to sign up and say yes, accordingly.
Your book on the Chicago or the Illinois Black Panther Party, one of the things you say early in the book that was really striking to me is that there is not a lot of research that's been done on the Chicago Panther Party, the Illinois Chicago Panther Party, and Fred Hampton himself. But what do you think is the reason for that?
There's a number of obstacles. The Panthers themselves, actually. They are not open, many of them, I should say, as a institutional, as a chapter, by not really open and speaking to people they don't trust quite easily. And there's factionalization within the party as there's factionalization within its chapter. And so if you get certain information from some members of the organization, then others may not speak to you. So you have all this reverence and discord amongst those members. So it's very difficult to get folks to trust you. It took me 7 years to get them to trust me, actually. As a graduate student, he accused me of being an FBI agent. He told me I was too young to know that much information about them. So I had to explain to them his research and understand how COINTELPRO works. I get that. So I was fortunate enough to meet Kathleen Cleaver, who introduced me to Michael D. McCarty, who lived in Inglewood, California at the time, in the Illinois chapter. And every September he returns to Chicago for a birthday party, and all the members are there. And so whether they wanted me there or not, I was a fly on the wall and asking questions, and it took me time to win them over, but I was able to win a significant number of those members over to submit documents and interviews and so forth. But it took a lot of work.
Normally when we think about the Black Panther Party, we always think about the Bay Area. We think about the New York contingent. As well known as Fred Hampton has become, we don't necessarily know the Illinois Party the same way. And one of the things that struck me in your description of them is that for them, their political engagement wasn't a new formation. They really brought the kind of civil rights grassroots experience that they had prior to the Black Panther Party and brought some of that experience to their work in Illinois. Talk about how important it was for them to not see themselves as a rupture from a black activist tradition, but actually an extension of it.
All right, so in civil rights, black power discourse, there's the traditional way of talking about it. There's this benevolent movement, and then all of a sudden, 65, people get angry, pick up guns. And so most of the scholarship that my work is in concert with is building on new scholarship that challenged that old paradigm that there's this contingent of folks who are doing civil rights work, but also doing armed self-defense, doing organizing, and so forth. So Chicago was no different. So when Martin Luther King brought the nonviolent civil rights movement to Chicago to bring that movement north, he joined the nexus of groups who were already there, right? The CCCO, the KOCO, and others who are already doing that kind of work. And they were trying to instill in him, we don't turn the other cheek here. But we'll give it a try, but it's not gonna work. And it didn't. Right? So you had folks on the ground in the high schools also, Fred Hampton, for example, and Proviso East and others around the city doing this kind of work too. ended up joining this movement, and then it didn't work. They continued to do that kind of work. So even as a member of the Black Panther Party, for example, Fred Hampton was president of the NAACP Youth Council prior to being recruited into one of the founders of the Illinois chapter of Black Panther Party. And one of his missions was to integrate public space, particularly swimming pools, in Chicago. This is 1968, 69. It's not North Carolina in 1950s. This is up south, as we call it, in Chicago. And so as a member of the Black Panther Party, he didn't divorce himself from that civil rights work. He continued to do that as he advocated for a revolutionary armed struggle against the capitalist structures of the United States.
Folks forget how young Hampton actually was. You talk about the fact that what they were doing in Illinois, and Hampton in particular, could have been a blueprint for the next generation of what the Black liberation movement looked like. Talk about what it was about his background that let him be so engaged the way he was as a young person. And also, from the hindsight of 50 plus years, what's his legacy at this point in time?
Oh, well, that's a large question. That's a book project. As succinct as possible, Fred Hampton is a upper middle class kid, actually. Both of his parents worked for Corn Products Company. They were actually foremen. So it says a lot about the company where a woman could actually be a foreman, a black woman and man. So he moved to these suburbs. So he wasn't actually in Chicago. He lived in a western middle class suburb of Chicago. And as a child, his mother, Iberia Hampton, used to babysit Emmett Till. And Emmett Till and their relatives worked at the same company, right? So he had that kind of connection to that kind of those tragedies. And so growing up in Chicago, he and Emmett Till become these martyrs of the movement. So when he gets involved into the political arena, he's studying Martin Luther King, he's studying Malcolm X and others, their speeches. So he has his reputation of being this great orator, which is why the NAACP recruits him to recruit young folks into the organization, which is why Bobby Rush and others recruit him to help found the Black Panther Party. And then he's doing all this community organizing, cross race in this middle class neighborhood in this predominantly white school that he goes to in the suburbs. And he brings that organizing tradition to the party, which are coming from various tenants to SNCC and other places. So he continues that work. And then there's the creation by another organizer called Bob Lee. His name is actually Robert E. Lee III, this black man from Houston, Texas, who comes to Chicago. Everyone's migrating to Chicago and creates this idea by the Rainbow Coalition. So the two of them start this idea of racial coalition politics. And then he really has this national forte, Fred Hampton, because he becomes the de facto leader of this interracial coalition of the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, and the Black Panther Party.
Do you think Jesse Jackson was conscious of that history when he signaled his campaign as the Rainbow Coalition?
So I've interviewed Reverend Jackson several times. He won't allow me to release those interviews, but I'm not kind to him, and in some ways Obama in a sense in the book, not out of spite. I respect and have a lot of endearing things and qualities about those individuals, but they did appropriate the politics, the organized tradition. These were some of the slogans of this racial coalition politics, excuse me, the Rainbow Coalition. And so he's very conscious of it. In fact, there's all these evidences of conflict between the group and Reverend Jackson as the organization, it's a socialist organization. And Jesse Jackson is, at that particular time, well, in some ways still is capitalist enterprise. So what he wanted to do, for example, was take all the businesses in the African American community that were not black owned and remove them. And Fred Hampton and the party rejected that. So they had these classes, I mean literally the physical classes, where they argued it's not about race, it's about exploitation. So you want to take these white people who exploit us economically and replace it with some black people who are going to exploit us economically. So they totally rejected that. But at the same time, once Fred Hampton is assassinated, Jesse Jackson is one of the first people to rally the troops around uncovering the conspiracy and the assassination and keeping his legacy and the spirit alive. So there's all these discourse that take place. Chicago politics is muddy.
Yeah. I think about Jay-Z name dropping Fred Hampton a few years ago. he was born. Jay-Z was born the same day that Fred Hampton
yep.
dies. And still, despite the fact that we can have a conversation about Hampton in Chicago, there's still few people who actually know much about his story. But my own introduction to him was through Eyes on the Prize, when they first broadcasted in the late 1980s, then reading Hakeem Aboodi's piece, One-Sided Shootout. What do you think the Illinois Black Panther Party has to teach young activists in 2019?
Well, there's two things. There's the Trump era. So much of the conditions in which the party's purpose for founding and organizing for are still conditions as exist today, even more so exacerbated with the addition of things like HIV/AIDS, crack cocaine, mass incarceration, things that were prevalent in the 60s that are adding to those issues of poverty and social and economic neglect. And so what the party did was give a blueprint on how to organize and create your own programs, self-sustaining, community-run programs, and real coalitions amongst folks for those purposes, right? So that's the lesson that folks are, much of the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm thinking of particularly of groups like BYP 100 in Chicago and Solace Daughters and others, model themselves after some of the organizing work that the party did, not the ideology, but the actual grassroots organizing work.
Right.
So there's a lot of linkages there in that regard. And then also as a result, there's the repression that most of these groups today face, similar to the party and others did as far as COINTELPRO, and surveillance and social media surveillance and doing some of the self-policing as well by advertising what you're doing. So they're conscious of those things as well. So it's the two-pronged legacy, the need to continue to be active and organized, but also be leery that the police are watching and trying to target these same groups. And so they continue that tradition, and the targeting of those groups is another continuing legacy as well.
You mentioned some of the distinctions between the Illinois Black Panther Party and what was happening out in the Bay. And we talked already about this kind of connection with grassroots civil rights movement issues. But you also note that the Illinois Black Panther Party dealt with gender in ways that were a little different. Talk a little bit about that.
So interviewing all these party members and talking to other party members around the country, it was Mumi Abu Jamal who enlightened me, he and Erica Huggins, that there was not one Black Panther Party. There's these multiple parties. So the best way to really understand the Black Panther Party is at the local bottom grassroots level. Each chapter is different.
It's like the UNIA,
pretty much.
Early in the 20th
So what's happening in Oakland tends to overshadow all the other 49 chapters across the nation, but that's not what's taking place in Illinois. For example, Illinois it's not the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, it's the Illinois chapter, because that state is a state chapter with 19 branches throughout the state, right, in all these various cities, and mostly college campuses. So it operates quite differently than most other chapters around the country. So that's one distinction, and as a result of that, as from its founding, half of those people in leadership are women. And so it's not the brothers coming to this idea that we need to treat women on equal playing field. No, it's the women asserting their agency and demanding that respect and leading these organizations like SNCC and others to join the cause for that reason. And as a result, when folks from Oakland come to Chicago with some of those hyper-masculine tendencies and exploitations, it's the women and the brothers in Chicago together who sometimes physically assault those people in leadership positions in Oakland and let them know we don't do that here. You might want to go talk to the leadership about how we do things here in Chicago. And so most of those people in leadership positions are women, and they're doing the grunt work of going out and, so I call Illinois the national headquarters east. So everyone, I guess you could say east of the Mississippi, all those chapters answer to Illinois. And then Illinois responded to Oakland. And so most of the people checking on those chapters and making sure they run and operate right were women from the Illinois chapter party, folks like Yvonne King and others.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Jakobi Williams, Associate Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Indiana. He is also the author of From Bullet to Ballot, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and Racial Coalition Project Politics in Chicago, published by UNC Press. What's next for you?
Too many things. So I'm actually, to be totally honest, doing work on the Panthers is tough business. It's just too complicated. I have a lot more.
I know Scott Brown has talked about that.
Oh, wow.
And writing about Karinga and us.
You're writing about people who are alive, right?
Right.
And so not everyone's always happy with your work.
Yeah.
And it's a story you can't romanticize. So what I'm doing now is the first book really ends technically with the murder of Fred Hampton. I give a history of Chicago and a history of the chapter, because when we talk about Chicago, most people only talk about his death.
Right.
They don't know there's all these other things that's happening. And so the first book pretty much try to articulate the legacy of the party, that it's this racial coalition, the original Rainbow Coalition that helps lead to the first African-American mayor in Chicago, then subsequently the first African-American president, who's not by accident comes out of Chicago using racial coalition politics. These are not new phenomena. So the second book is trying to continue that story of the original Rainbow Coalition, tell the complete history of that group. And then also, I've been to almost 20 countries in the last 4 years, writing a book about the transnational impact of the Black Panther Party. There's all these groups around the world who actually emulate them. Yeah. So I particularly ignore Africa and the Caribbean. I'm not interested in those groups where the Panthers had connections, where they actually went. So I'm interested in these groups that had no connection to the party, had no connection to Black people in some cases.
But picked up on
But by emulating these folks, people in India or Israel and Palestine, New Zealand, and so forth and so on. And some people have done some of this work, but most of the folks who've done it actually haven't gone to these places and talked to these people and looked at those archives. So I have. So that's my baby there, the transnational impact of the party. Plus it lets me go somewhere besides Chicago. Right? So it's difficult because I'm a trained U.S. historian doing all this transnational work.
Right.
And all these various languages I have to learn and all these documents I can't read. And especially when we get to talking about the Dalit Panthers in India. I have about 7 different languages of documents, and I'm not sure what to do with it at this point. But that's the 2 projects I hope to complete by this time next year.
We've been joined today by historian Jakobi Williams. Thank you, Jakobi, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
At the top is Barack and a stack of all black jeans, cause I'm never gonna slack. Black boy shorts on my ass, like teachers stay on short. Black boys in class, so they grow to lead the masses. Black sunglasses, cause my future bright, molasses